spring football storylines. Number one, this ties in all the conversations we've been having on today's show and the shows for the last 2 months. Building chemistry with so many new coaches. That's the number one thing that I'm looking for. Because, guys, it's only been a couple of weeks since new coordinators were hired. Lance Guidry and Shannon Dawson. New linebackers coach Derek Nicholson, same deal. He's been on the staff for just a few weeks now. The new running backs coach Tim Harris Jr. has been on board for about a week. And the new wide receivers coach Kevin Beard has been on the job for less than 24 hours at this point. So spring ball, it's going to give an opportunity for all of these coaches. It's going to give them their first chance to evaluate the roster in person and start to build those practice habits with these players, because players don't really know how these coaches like to run things in drills. Coaches don't really know what these players can do. And then on the flip side of that, it gives these coaches a chance to build chemistry with one another, because I don't know how well Shannon Dawson and Kevin Beard know each other and how well Tim Harris, he probably knows Kevin Beard very well, but I don't know how well Tim Harris knows Shannon Dawson. Defensive coaches, same thing. Relationships will truly start to get built this Saturday at Greentree, because we have to build that kind of chemistry and rapport. I know that a lot of people will bring up with new coordinators, right? 2 new coordinators, installing the playbooks. Obviously, that's important, but I don't worry as much about that practice one, week one, this time of year in spring, because you don't get too advanced with what you're running in practices in the spring games at this stage. But yeah, installation will also be happening, but the urgency for that is not going to ramp up just yet. There's plenty of time to get that stuff installed between now and fall camp. And listen, on coaching and chemistry, I'll emphasize again why this is so important. We heard plenty of rumors last year about the former running backs coach and the former wide receivers coach having relationship problems with their players, and some of these coaches having relationship problems with one another, right? Because I don't think the OC and the quarterbacks coach were ever on the same page last year. Stuff like that cannot happen again, right? Like starting quarterback Tyler Van Dyke said when he was interviewed earlier this week on ESPN, the only way for this team to succeed is to do it as a family, right? They need to build that family relationship. So that's storyline number one. Number two, I can't wait for this. I mean, as someone who's going to be going out to as many practices as I'm allowed to go out to, evaluating the transfers. Yes, Miami added a handful of players in the portal who most of these guys are going to be candidates to start next season, right? And all of Miami's transfers enrolled early in time for spring, which is great. So I would be shocked if former Alabama guard Javion Cohen and former UCF center Matt Lee aren't both opening day starters on the O-line for this team, because both of them, especially Lee, have been crushing the offseason program. I expect Matt Lee to be one of the team leaders this year, because that dude just seems to be an alpha. Like, he seems to be that sort of guy that leads by example and kind of leads through his words as well. And when you talk about Javion Cohen and Matt Lee, they're both experienced offensive linemen, multiple year starters, and neither of them have been credited with giving up a sack in their careers to this point. Elsewhere, linebacker Francisco Mauigoa comes over from Washington State. Based on the footage that I watched of him playing at Wazoo, this guy looks good enough to be a potential starter next year at linebacker. I could see him starting alongside Wes Basaint. So I guess the question would be, can Mauigoa actually take Corey Flagg's job? Because Flagg has, always been, he's always been just consistent enough and good enough to keep that job. I'm intrigued by both of the new defensive tackles, Branson Dean, Thomas Gore. I mean, Gore especially jumps off the page, and he intrigues me because he was playing outside the Power 5 last year at Georgia State. So, he was facing lesser competition for the most part, but he did play well against North Carolina, for example. And this guy was extremely disruptive at the line of scrimmage at Georgia State. Great range. He's undersized, though. I think he's like around 6 foot. So he's undersized at defensive tackle, 275. But I'm really excited to see what this dude can do. And defensive backs, Terry Roberts, graduate transfer cornerback from Iowa. When I first caught wind of him months ago, being interested in Miami. I think I underestimated Terry Roberts, but the more digging and research and the more I watched of him, this guy, I think, can definitely compete for a starting job and for significant snaps. And then Davonte Brown, transfer from UCF, older brother of Damari Brown, same deal. I think he could potentially walk right into the starting lineup in one of those two starting corner spots. So there's a lot of talent. I know Miami didn't bring in like quite as many players or as many big names as Florida State brought in the transfer portal, because Florida State crushed it in the portal, but Miami brought in some guys who can start or at least compete to start, and I love that. Storyline number 3, I'm going to be looking closely throughout the spring at quarterback development. Yeah, it's Tyler Van Dyke's team, but let's not forget the TVD. He missed significant time with injury last year. So will Miami's season be ruined if Van Dyke, God forbid, has to miss any time this year? I hope that doesn't happen. But I like the fact that Shannon Dawson is both the offensive coordinator and the quarterback's coach, because that'll mean this year, unlike last year, the game planning and play calling is going to be in sync with the quarterbacks, because you got the same guy handling all of that. All right. Now, Shannon Dawson, he's had success with mobile quarterbacks, so I look forward to seeing what he can do for Jakari Brown's development, because, Jakari, so fast, so athletic, so much potential. He's got a strong arm. He just has to harness that, and he's got to develop the accuracy and the timing. And the whole reading defenses and everything is what Jakari Brown has to work on. And then Emory Williams, new faces are always exciting. I want to see how the true freshman Emory Williams can look as well. And for Van Dyke, I know that I say, hey, it's Van Dyke's team. He's the starter. It seems like he's the shoe-in to be the starter this year. But then at the same time, Van Dyke has to bounce back. He had a down year last year. It looked like he was finally starting to get it a little bit, and then he got injured, but he was not very good for the first 3-4 games of the year. It was up until the North Carolina game was when it started to click for Van Dyke, but the first handful of games last season, Van Dyke was not playing very well, so he's still got a lot to prove, I think, and he's capable, because we saw how good TVD was in 2021. He's got to bring that form back. I'm going to be watching the wide receiver reps and the wide receiver drills. This is a position group that in 2 out of 3 spots does not have clear starters. There's a lot wide open at wide receiver. Now, Xavier Restrepo should have the slot position locked down, but on the outside, your guess is as good as mine. And I'm going to be watching receivers so closely because, last spring and fall camp, I was watching the wide receivers, and there wasn't a whole lot to be happy about last year. And we saw that, of course, manifest itself on game days, because last spring and fall camp, all that we were talking about were dropped balls, dropped passes left and right. Nobody in that receiving core outside of Restrepo was catching anything consistently this time of year last year. So Kevin Beard, you need to coach these young men up, and I know he wants to do that. So I want to see true competition, and I want to see these guys flashing between Frank Ladson, Jacoby George, Colby Young, Michael Redding, Isaiah Horton competing for 2 outside spots. And even with Xavier Restrepo, even with him more than likely holding it down at the slot, because I can't see anyone beating him out for that starting job, Miami's got so much talent there. They're really deep at slot receiver. Brashard Smith, who's been around for a couple of years. And then you've got the true freshman sensations coming in, Ray Joseph and Robbie Washington. So I believe both Ray and Robbie, I think they're both early enrollees, and I believe they can both contribute year one. So you're going to have to find a way to get some of these guys on the field at the same time as Restrepo. So I can't wait to see what sort of offensive experimentation. Now, as far as experimentation goes, you're not going to see much of that in the spring. Spring football is going to be very vanilla, right? So they're not going to be throwing out the Statue of Liberty plays in March and April. But still, I want to see reps from all of these receivers, because you have a lot of talent on the slot. And also, Chris Johnson, he's a running back, but he played receiver as well in high school. He can be lined up outside as a receiver. He can give Shannon Dawson another gadget player to work with. So there's a lot of good stuff that he can work with in that offense.